Hello, folks, and welcome back to World War II TV. I hope you had a good weekend and a break from watching me and are ready for Airborne Week, which is our subject. 5 shows coming at you this week. Variety of subjects. Today, we are off to Crete in 1941, which will be quite cool because it's a subject I don't know a huge amount about, but I will do at the end of this show. So my guest today, it's been amazing. A year since he was on the first time, over a year. He was on for our Purple Heart Lane show when we discussed the attack by the 502nd into Carenton in Normandy, defended by elements of the Fallschirmjäger, and he was on for that and hasn't been back since, which is I'm remiss of me to not bring him back. But so Greg Way, historian about the Fallschirmjäger, is with us this evening. How are you doing, Greg?
I'm very well, Paul. Thank you for having me on.
Well, thank you for coming back. We enjoyed your company the first time, and we don't do really enough shows with a focus on the Axis side of things. As we all know, the majority of English-speaking historians write about the Allied side of things, and then you get that kind of specialist, like the Eastern Europeans write a lot about the German units, but there's not that many books and not that many English-speaking people to write about. Got Dr. Phil Blood, of course, coming up in September, talking about his new work. But anyway, you before we get into the presentation, your interest in Crete and Operation Mercury because of your interest in meeting Fallschirmjäger veterans. But what is it about the Crete operation that you think is kind of basically interesting? Is it because it was kind of had elements of success and failure at the same time? Is that kind of where the interest is for you?
Oh, definitely, yeah. Success and failure on both sides. And my interest is the human interest side, like you said, the veterans and the veteran stories, which led to becoming interested in researching more about Crete and places like Monte Cassino and other battlefields that they took part in. Because, as you said, there was a lot more 20 years ago. There was a lot more books written from the Allied perspective than there were German. So I decided to look into it a bit further.
And we're glad that you did. And the thing about I find is Crete often just gets that one line. You're reading a book about airborne operations later in the war, and it will say something like, "Not since the failure by the Germans in Operation Mercury." And that's it. You get that sentence where it's kind of used as an example of the learning curve of how to deploy airborne forces, but they don't go into much detail about it. And as we always talk about, that 1941-42 era is kind of generally the era we don't talk about as much as the latter part of the war, when essentially the Allies are winning. That's what we like to talk about, isn't it? Anyway, as with all my guests, you've got a lovely PowerPoint presentation, so we'll start things off. When you need me to move the slide, tell me to move on. I will do that. And if those watching, if you've got questions or comments, keep them going. The sidebar conversations are really fascinating in recent weeks. We thank you all for joining us, Lorelei, Angela, all the other regulars. So over to you, Greg, and when I have comments, I will jump in.
All right, Paul, cheers, thanks. Yeah, Operation Mercury, the Battle of Crete, lasted 13 days only, 20th of May and ended 1st of June. But it was a big battle. It fought over 4 different areas of operations between men of many nationalities, not just German, but there were Austrians, the British, the Australian, New Zealand. There were Spanish commandos, part of Lay Force. There were Palestinians and Cypriots. There was Army, RAF, Royal Navy. It was a battle of many nationalities and different forces from all countries. But within the Battle of Crete, there were so many independent battles for hills, airfields, and urban areas that every battle in World War II, there seems to be a hill that's fought over or an airfield. So I just want to give you a general overview combined with other aspects of the operation, interspersed with veteran accounts and some quotes. I do apologize for my lack of eloquence and the absence of a narrator. I did try to get someone like Richard Burton to do the veteran accounts, but I couldn't do it.
I think you'll find he's dead. I think that he's taking on less work, I think, these days, is Mr. Burton.
He is, yeah, the last 20 odd years, yeah. But hopefully by the end of this, it might sort of inspire somebody to go and read further about the Battle of Crete, because it is interesting, even though it only took a short period from start to finish. Paul has moved on to the next slide, which is brilliant. I can just see on my phone there. But I've read a lot of reviews recently on some of the more popular books, because now there are quite a few books from the 60s onwards, these general overview books that were published by Beevor, MacDonald, Tony Simpson, and they've all sort of written them from their own perspective. German writers like Shearer, Goller, and Richter write from the German perspective. There's a lot of books out there, but some of the reviews that I've read, the 3-star reviews, which I like to read, said that readers found the geography of Crete quite complex, and also they were dismayed almost by the amount of units that took part, which was the German side or the Allied side. I'll refer to them as allies instead of calling them British and Commonwealth and Greek troops. I'll just refer to them as Allied troops through this. So the slide you're looking at the moment just showing a relief map of Crete, and the top map showing you whereabouts it is in the Eastern Mediterranean Sea. And I've highlighted the 4 main sort of urban areas: Malmö, Hania, Retimo, and Heraklion there, and the distances between them, which becomes important later on. And if you look at the map, you can see that there's almost this continual spine of mountains running from east to west, west to east, whichever way you want to look at it, with a narrow coastal strip, well, not always narrow, but a coastal strip on the north coast of the island. And this mixed terrain that you'll see throughout Crete. When I see different terrain every time I go there, and this could be hills, ridges, stone terraces covered in olive groves and vineyards, rock strewn ground, stone walls, gullies, and ravines. It is real mixed terrain. But this slide just gives you an insight into what it looks like in relief, and we got some more maps as we go along. Next slide, Paul.
Yep.
Just to highlight that mix of terrain, I just put 4 photographs from my last visit there, and you can see this is in the west sector in Malmö, and the first photograph, number 1 there, is taken from Hill 107, which was an important feature overlooking the airfield at Malmö, and one of the objectives on the first day for Group West, which we'll talk about in a minute. And you can see, and I think somebody said on one of your programs before, Paul, that unless you go to a battlefield, you don't really appreciate the terrain, the geography, the topography. So I was amazed when I went up Hill 107 how actually close the northern slope is, and you can see there the airfield is almost in front of the slope. Such is the terrain. You've got this narrow coastal strip, and then the gentle sloping slopes going up to the hills, and then you've got ridges and ravines in between and gullies. So photograph 2 is just to the southwest of Hill 107, looking out towards the airfield in a north-northeast direction, and you can see the airfield there at the top of the picture, right almost on the beach. And what's an important feature there, I've put the old Tavernidis Bridge, which you can't see because it's obscured by the new road bridge. But back in 1941, May 20th, 1941, if you were standing in Dempler, in that little village on the heights overlooking the airfield to the northeast, you would have seen, well, a spectacle early in the morning. You would have that terrain there is now heavily vegetated. There's a lot of vegetation there that wasn't there in 1941. The old bridge crossed a dry riverbed that was rock strewn, and it was clear of vegetation. A few olive groves around, but not as vegetated as it is there now. But morning the 20th of May, you would have seen a lot of smoke, a lot of dust from the bombing that was going on before the gliders came in, and it would have been quite a spectacle to stand in that position in Dempler looking down towards the airfield and the
and just to jump in about the terrain there, Greg, because it's one of those things. You're absolutely right. We should go and visit battlefields when we can, but of course we have to accept the fact that sometimes cities have expanded, things have changed. I mean, the actual terrain in terms of the heights of mountains and hills, that doesn't tend to change, but the views and roadways change. We've got our Prima Sole bridge show coming up on Friday, and that area of Sicily, the bridge is very different to the bridge that was there 70 plus years ago. So going to battlefields is important, but you've got to go armed with understanding the changes over the decades. Otherwise, sometimes you can get yourself a bit confused and muddled if you don't keep up to what those changes have been.
Exactly, and with Crete, modern irrigation methods have made it possible to to grow things that didn't grow there 80 years ago. And the towns have expanded, and they've become, you know, like Malmö and Pyrgos have almost become one. And the city, the larger towns have expanded out to the countryside that would have been bare back then. Photograph 3, looking northeast from Hill 107, or northeast. Someone actually picked me up on my Facebook page about this photograph. It's not actually looking northeast, it's northeast. But you can see the other side of Hill 107 right out towards the Akrotiri Peninsula. So this is quite a lot of ground that was covered with Fallschirmjäger on the 20th of May. And number 4, you were looking at the north and northwest slope of Hill 107 running down to the airfield, the riverbed in the foreground, which is all overgrown, mostly overgrown. And in the background, you can see I've arrowed the Akrotiri Peninsula, which will be mentioned in a minute. The island in between is Theodori, different pronunciations, of course. Theodori Island on the way to Hania. So you could see the visibility is really good, as it was on the 20th of May. If you go next, Paul, please. And just a quick area comparison then and now. This is the old iron bridge, which still exists over the river, the dry riverbed. And the photograph on the left, you can see Hill 107, probably the north and northwest slopes of Kavkazia Hill, as it's known, referred to as Hill 107 because of its elevation. And you can see a lot of it is quite clear on the way up on that slope itself. And then the bottom one is a comparison that I took, you know, almost in the same position, but the vegetation and the trees that have grown in the riverbed. So again, you've got to orientate yourself when you go there and not expect to see it as it was 80 years ago, because it has changed a lot. And Crete really was a battle of firsts. It was first all air invasion, if you like, because the forces that were going to be landed on Crete, paratroopers using parachutes, glider troops and air landed troops. There wasn't going to be any support on the ground already there, no infantry. It was truly a first air invasion. Everything was going to come by air initially. It was the first Luftwaffe enterprise commanded by the Luftwaffe to involve all three aspects, all three branches of the Wehrmacht at that point in the war. It was the first time that all of the airborne forces from the 7th Flieger Division within the 11th Flieger Corps operated together in one operation. They had, back in May 1940, they'd been disjointed. You had elements in Belgium and you had elements in Holland and others up in Narvik in Norway in the June. Also the first time, well, not the first time that they jumped into heavy fire from defences on the ground, but on this scale, they hadn't come under fire like this, even in Holland the year before. And these were well camouflaged, well defended and undetected. That's the most important thing, undetected positions on the ground, which caused heavy casualties in almost all of the operating areas. And you can see on the right, the information from Ultra was used a lot in planning for defence on Crete. So the Germans were unaware that their radio traffic was being intercepted from the end of April. The Allies knew about the plans for Crete, so they could plan accordingly on the island. And then the other thing is the first time that the German paratroopers had encountered stiff resistance from the civilian population. And I think somebody, you had the resistance program before, saying the resistance began as soon as the boots touched the ground. Well, in some places, before the boots touched the ground, they'd organised resistance from the civilian population, which we briefly mention later. So, General Student, who was the commander 11th Flieger Corps, which had 7th Flieger Division as the first German airborne division within its ranks. He'd been shot in the head in Rotterdam in May 1940, towards the end of the campaign. And he was near death for a while, but it took him till January 1941 to recuperate. And when he retook command, he started working on plans for independent Fallschirmjäger operations, because if you think about it, all that the paratroopers had done from the end of the campaign in the Low Countries, or Narvik in June, for example, they'd been idle. They'd been preparing for Operation Sea Lion, but come to any. So he wanted to prove they could still do, conduct an airborne operation, and he set his sights on Mediterranean and Middle East. So he began planning these operations for Cyprus, for Gibraltar, for Crete. So obviously on the 21st of April, the Operation Mercury is in full swing. It's almost coming to its conclusion in Greece, the campaign in Greece. But Göring and Student go to meet Hitler near Vienna on the 21st of April. And at this point, Hitler is completely obsessed with forthcoming Operation Barbarossa and didn't really show much interest. Once Peloponnese had been taken, after the airborne operation on the 26th, that seemed to be for him the end of Operation Mercury. But Student, along with Göring, managed to sort of persuade him. At the beginning of the meeting, he was more interested in Malta. The Student put him off because the lack of landing areas, drop zones, and the fact Allied troops rally quite quickly on a small island, and put him off. So he left him a lot to think about, because Crete was a large island, you had your narrow coastal strip, you had the airfields, you had the port. So Hitler did think about it, and on the 23rd, the 11th Flieger Corps was given the heads up that Hitler had agreed that maybe Crete would be an ideal conclusion to the Greek campaign. It would protect his southeast flank, and there are lots of books cover reasons why Hitler decided on Crete. It would protect. If they took Crete, it would deny the Allies the use of the airfields, like attack Ploesti field in Romania. That perhaps it was just going to be done as a feint to take attention away from his preparation to Barbarossa. The Russians and the British looking on and think it's just a feint. So on the 20th of April, Directive 28 is released, the seizure of Crete, and this was basically Crete was going to be a base for air.
Your audio is popping in and out a bit at the moment, Greg. I don't know what's going on. It was fine. Okay? It's just popping a little bit. I don't know why it's doing that, but it started off fine. The last couple minutes it started popping.
I've got no indication here at all. I can still hear your voice.
Okay, it's workable. It's just popping a little bit. I don't know why. We always get that. When we were chatting before we went live, everything's fine. The minute you go live, the gremlins always kick in. But no, it's understand. It's just popping every now and then. But we'll carry on.
It's typical. Can you still hear me? Right. Okay.
Yeah,
so directive number 28. Perhaps I'm speaking too loud in this small room. I'll quieten down. So, like I said, the main reason for directive number 28, but I've highlighted in red some of the other interesting aspects of it. That the army is to provide reinforcements for the airborne troops that move on to Crete, and a seaborne element. Hitler was insistent that there was a seaborne element. He didn't want the paratroops to end up being caught stood on one leg, if you know what I mean. He put that in as a caveat. There must be an amphibious aspect. In fact, Student failed to follow up on that. He put that to the back of his plans, and it got back to Hitler that the amphibious aspect was being overlooked, and Student had to be kindly reminded that he is to introduce an amphibious element to his operational plans. The big thing for Hitler was that Operation Mercury was in no way to delay the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, because of course many of the assets used in Mercury were going to be used in Russia. And interestingly enough, Student said that he thought there was no plans for the airborne forces in our Operation Barbarossa, that there was no use for them, or they weren't going to be used in the early stages of the operation whenever it started. Yet in Directive 28, it says that after the occupation, all or part of the airborne forces must be ready for new tasks. So Student thought perhaps he's now on side with me about these independent airborne operations in other places like Cyprus and Suez Canal and Syria, wherever. And the next slide, Paul, is just a graphic from from the period, just showing Crete and its strategic importance in the Mediterranean. And a bit optimistic there, a key point to the Suez and on the way to India, which of course never happened. But it just shows the potential for independent airborne operations east and west, and Alexandria, the Suez Canal.
I mean, I think when you were saying about the reasons for attacking Crete, both the Allies and the Axis, in some ways, it doesn't really matter which bit of the Mediterranean you have, as long as you've got somewhere. You know, there's Malta, there's Crete, there's North Africa. As long as each player has got somewhere they can use as a base, exactly which bit you use, I wouldn't say it doesn't matter, but you just need to have some kind of base of operations there because of the strategic reasons of the whole area.
Yeah, of course. I mean, Goller, the German author Goller, wrote that even if the British had maintained Crete, they could still attack the Ploesti oil fields with bombers from North Africa. But the problem is their fighter support. They wouldn't be able to have the range of the fighter support from Crete. So even though the Aegean Islands and Greece and all the other countries they have to cross to get to Ploesti could be absolutely riddled with flak. So you would need that fighter support, and if they send up aircraft or whatever. So even Goller calls that sort of moot point, if you like, about using it to protect the Ploesti oil fields.
Well, I think you make the good point there, Greg, about the need to think of the Mediterranean in terms of all those elements: air power, naval power, logistics, maintaining presence on the ground. But I mean, we've got Mediterranean Week coming up in October on World War II TV because, again, as we've talked about, so often people talk about the naval side of things, or they talk about the air operations, or they talk about, in this case, a parachute or an airborne landing. The Mediterranean is all about the contextual look at the whole side of it. And, you know, as you say, it's controlling air channels, it's controlling sea routes. And I think all of us are guilty of not spending enough time thinking about the Mediterranean, all the aspects of it. It's a very complicated arena, I think, of warfare. Oh,
yeah, definitely. I mean, and even Suda Bay on Crete with its port facilities, you know, the denial of that to the Royal Navy, the ability to resupply German forces in North Africa. You know, there were lots of benefits of taking it and not letting the British keep it when the Cretans keep it. Well, the planning began then, but bearing in mind that there was only sort of just over 3 weeks to plan, and a lot of it was going to ended up being improvised. But Student, of course, he favoured the oil spot tactics and attacked multiple targets simultaneously across the island. That was his favoured approach. But then on the other hand, you had General Law, who was commander of the Air Fleet 4, and Admiral Schuster, who's Admiral Southeast, who just wanted one objective, just to concentrate on one objective, such as Malmö in the west. And then once you've secured the airfield, land troops in and then push east. But Student argued against that. Von Richthofen, who was 8th Flieger Corps commander, he was concerned about the provision of air cover because his fighters and bombers were going to be supporting the airdrop. They would be important in keeping the defenders' heads down when the paratroopers are jumping at their aircraft or the gliders are landing. And then General Conrad, who was at the 11th Flieger Corps with the transport aircraft, was concerned about the number of transport aircraft and being able to utilize enough aircraft to drop paratroopers in several different simultaneous objectives. So in the end, the decision went back to Goering, and Goering opted for a two-wave attack, one in the morning and one in the PM. But of course, that causes problems because if you attack one part of the island in the morning, then the other part of the island is going to be completely alert by the time their turn comes for the air assault. So the 11th Flieger Corps attack plan, this is from Yanis Prikatsanakis' book, and it's quite a good basic graphic. Split up into three groups. You have Group West, which will be the assault regiment or the Sturm regiment, this so-called elite within an elite, you know, trained in glider landings, etc., who would jump in around and land in their gliders in the Malmö sector to take the airfield and Hill 107, which looked over the airfield, and prepare it. Well, it depended which airfield was going to be taken first, that air landing troops could be brought in. They had support units from the corps troops and the divisional troops. Then Group Centre, sorry, going back to Malame, General Meindl. So Eugen Meindl was going to be the commander of Group West. Then Mittem, the Group Centre is going to be split into two parts. In the morning, Hania, and in the afternoon, Retimo. So in Hania, there was no airfield. It was the port facilities at Suda Bay, which is on the other side of the Akrotiri Peninsula there, that the Royal Navy used. Their mission was to attack the aircraft around the Akrotiri Peninsula, to tie up as many troops as possible, because the Allies believed that the majority of the troops were based in and around Hania and Suda Bay, protecting those areas, and also protect the southern flank. And then in the afternoon, the second wave, which would be 8 hours later, you would have the assault on Retimo and Heraklion. Retimo, a small airstrip in the eastern part of their area of operations. They would secure the airstrip and also secure the town of Retimo. And Heraklion in the afternoon, with its Phoenician walled town and harbour facilities, secure them and secure the airfield, which is about 2 kilometres to the east of the city, and also a radio station further to the east. So they all had these fairly optimistic objectives, but they were optimistic because of their intel. The intel told them that the defenders, there weren't going to be that many defenders. And we'll come on to the next slide. Well, in fact, we won't. We'll come on to intel in a minute. The German forces, so they've got an attack plan. They need the forces. On the right there, you've got students, 11th Flieger Corps, with the 7th Flieger Division under General Sussman, with the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd regiments, 1st under Bruno Breuer, the 2nd under Alfred Sturm, and the 3rd under Richard Heydrich, with divisions troop. You've got the Luftland Sturm Regiment, the assault regiment, this elite within an elite that's going to land at Malame. And I've put there the commander Meindl. I know the photograph's quite small on the next slide, Paul, sorry. And to the right, you've got Hermann Ramke, and he's quite important because he was on the ground to train the 5th Mountain Division. The 5th Mountain Division replaced the 22nd Air Landing Division. They had been the partner of the 7th Flieger Division in Holland, and they were trained in air landing operations. But they were guarding the oil fields at Ploesti, so they were unable, due to the fact that a lot was going on in Greece when the campaign finished. You had troops heading north to prep for Operation Barbarossa. So you had occupation troops heading south, and you had all the Operation Mercury forces coming down to Greece as well. So they couldn't get 22nd Air Landing Division. So the 12th Army provided the 5th Mountain Division, which was probably the best placed division. They had been in action in Greece. They cracked the Metaxas line. They were combat experienced men. So Ramke was given the job of training these guys in air landing operations, which I'd imagine is nothing more than put a life jacket on, and when the plane comes to stop, you jump off. But that's why he was on the ground. Alongside the Flieger Corps, you got the air transport under General Conrad, charged the transport methods, the U-52s and the gliders, and then the 8th Flieger Corps, General von Richthofen, cousin of the famous Red Baron, with his air support squadrons, Stukas, dive bombers, your single engine, twin engine fighters, reconnaissance aircraft. So quite a mix of paratroop, all Luftwaffe, apart from head of naval operations Admiral Schuster. He was tasked with putting together the amphibious element. 2 sea squadrons he put together using completely improvised vessels from the south coast ports in Greece. These are cakes or small motor powered vessels, barges, anything you could find, with Greek crews, a few Kriegsmarine to help man the vessels, because there were no Kriegsmarine assets in the Eastern Mediterranean at the time, and there were no attack barges or that may have been used in Operation Sea Lion. He had to completely rely on what he could get his hands on in the southern Greek ports. So the 12th Army also provided other units, 1 regiment, 6th Mountain Division, some flak, some pioneers, and elements of Panzer Regiment 31 as well were provided by 12th Army. So next, preparations and logistics on the next slide, Paul.
And just a question from Phil Blood had a question for you, Greg, and I think you've half covered it already, but did the loss of transports in 1940 impact on the plans and the waves of assault? Because although, from my point of view, the various parachute landings, the airborne landings of May 1940 were mostly successful, they do use up a lot of transport, don't they? And they're struggling to get enough built for the next operation. So are they affected by those losses? No,
even though in Holland some aircraft had to land in the streets, but they weren't. There wasn't the losses that was sustained in Crete. Crete was a massive loss. It had a massive knock-on effect to future air support operations. But no, it didn't. It would have affected them if they'd gone with a plan to attack several different objectives at once. They wouldn't have had enough aircraft. But the plan that came out, they believed they had enough aircraft. In some cases, they had to leave men behind in Greece, but it was all based on intel. They believed, we'll come on to intel in a minute, and you'll see why the number of U-52s that were available for the operation seemed suffice to the Germans because of the intel that they believed, the forces that were on Crete. But
the recurring theme in terms of our study of Allied airborne operations is often the ambitions of airborne forces are greater than the logistical support behind them. In that it's all very well planned in these, Arnhem, Market Garden. You're limited by how many transports you've got. You're limited by that backbone of support that the Air Force can provide behind you, because people like Student and his opposite numbers in the Allies, they're very ambitious. They want to use this new arm, this airborne arm, but as I say, they often have to wait for the rest of the logistics to catch up with their ideas.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true. And you'll see when we come on to intel why they were so optimistic, and hence why the resources that they put into it was believed that would be suffice for the operation.
Yeah.
Especially in the two-wave operation. So the preparation and logistics, I said before, they only had 3 weeks, just over 3 weeks to plan for this. And the movement, as they thought, was being conducted in complete secrecy. But we know now that it wasn't, because it's being monitored all the time by the Allies. They knew when troops were arriving in Greece. But from the German perspective, they thought this was a pretty good effort to get everything from Germany and those forces that were already in Greece, getting them to the right place at the right time. It was quite a massive operation to move so many men from Germany, and in hundreds of trucks, I said, loaded. It says they're loaded on the trains between 27th of April and 3rd of May, and transported 1,500-mile journey down south, offloaded, and then loaded the trucks offloaded and going by by road through Greece down to the final destination of the airfield. And for example, the assault regiment, they had to prepare 3,653 parachutes before they left. That took a few days for those to be prepared. The cargo parachutes, for example, all had to be prepared, and that's just one regiment. So they had to make all these preparations before they even left Germany. But by 14th of May, the paratroops and the glider troops were all in tented camps near the airfields, using British tents, captured tents. I think it was about 2,000 tents they captured from the British and used them near the airfields. The big thing was the fuel problems, and that was partly created by Operation Hannibal, which was to capture the Corinth Canal Bridge on the 26th of April by the 2nd Regiment. And the bridge blew up and it blocked the Corinth Canal. And so that had a knock-on effect on fuel arriving in southern Greece to be used at the airfield. Hitler wanted the operation to start no later than the 16th of May, but that was impractical. The date moved then from the 18th of May to the 20th, due mainly to the fuel problems. Drop containers was another thing. That over 5,000 drop containers were used on Crete, and they had to be fetched from the Operation Sea Lion stores up in northern France. That everywhere was scoured for weapon containers, supply containers. all the U-52s that have been in Greece were sent back to Czechoslovakia, Austria, and Germany for overhaul, a quick overhaul, and then sent back down to the airfields in Greece. It was quite a mammoth task, really. The gliders, you can see in one of the photographs, are transported by rail to a certain point, taken off, reassembled, and then towed down into Greece. The preparations, the makeshift preparations for these 2 sea squadrons was well underway. Preparation for the airfields, that was another improvised exercise as well, preparing makeshift airfields for the paratroops aircraft that were going to take off from Greece to Crete. And then, of course, the commencement of the bombing campaign, which began in early May, in bombing some targets, and then it sort of ramped up as it got closer to the invasion date. And within the last week, they were concentrating on the 4 operational areas. And the Allies used to refer to it as the daily hate. Every month, same time, the Luftwaffe would come over and they would bomb and strafe the ground. So intel, the intel sources, some books will only refer to reconnaissance squadrons from the 8th and 11th Flieger Corps, and they don't mention anything about the Abwehr, or they say that the Abwehr military intelligence wasn't involved in Operation Mercury. Well, even the German files that I've got here, they mention Abwehr because they're using these V-men, these informants on the ground, and getting information back from them in Greece. And by questioning Greek sailors, so Greek sailors that have come from Crete, they're stopping them at sea and asking them, you know, what have you seen on Crete? Anything be of interest to us? So I've just put a little extract from a report from the 25th of April, bearing in mind this is the day that Directive 28 was released. And all they had identified are the 4 airfields and different aircraft types like Hurricanes and Gladiators, and on the airfields, tented camps, things that you could easily see from the air, you know, from a reconnaissance flight, and barracks. They'd identified the radio stations south of Hania and east of Heraklion, which were potential objectives. A few flak positions had been spotted, but not many at that point. No significant number of Greek troops. Some authors believe that there were no Greek troops on. I read one the other day, I can't remember which one, that there were no Greek troops on Crete during the operation, which is completely wrong. But they'd come to the conclusion that it was only about 4,000 to 5,000 British troops on. When I say British, they classed them all as British, so it didn't matter if they were Australian or New Zealand, they would class them as British. So in a brigade or maybe small divisional strength, and maybe just one armored unit on the whole island. And then the next slide, Paul, is just an extract from the on the next slide, Paul, is the extract.
Yep.
Oh, sorry.
There we go. I'm ready. Yep, there we are.
That's the one. The last intel report from the 18th of May, 11th Flieger Corps report. So they've identified at this point, so this is the day that the invasion should have begun, but was delayed because of logistical problems. So 2 days before the actual invasion, there they are. They've identified certain positions. In Heraklion, for example, 4 guns, but unknown location. That's probably from a V-man report or something, but grossly underestimated. 26 coastal guns from Hania to Drepano, which is down in the southeast, which also encompassed Suda Bay, almost in the middle of that location, which is expected because they expected most Allied troops to be in that area. They identified how many aircraft were on the island, bearing in mind that on the 19th, the RAF left the island for good. Well, they didn't. They came back during the battle, but they left before the battle began on the 20th. They left on the 19th. In fact, the troops referred to them, I believe, as rare as fairies, RAF rare as fairies, because of their absence during the beginning of the operation. They'd identified possibly an artillery regiment, 30 light tanks on the north coast, spread around the different areas, more flak machine guns, 300 vehicles. They were to play an important part because the German troops that landed at Retimo, part of their operational plan was to make good any vehicles that they found. They even took MT motor transport spares that they'd taken in Dunkirk to make good any vehicles that have been disabled so they could make themselves mobile.
Well, so that is planning. That's foresight, isn't it? Yeah. Wow.
So I've got a document here with a list of spares that they took with them, everything from spark plugs to carburetors for different trucks that have been apprehended, you know, during France, the campaign in France, Dunkirk. I mean, V-Men report this at the end here, they'd even identified the fact there were 16,300 Italian POs in 10 camps, including the number of guards that were guarding them. And also the last one, that from overhearing soldiers, maybe in the street, in cafes, that the Allies were expecting an attack on the north coast, but also on the south coast. So even then, you know, they had these informants were reporting back that they were expecting an attack, or possibly expecting an attack. But obviously the sources for that weren't revealed, i.e. ultra intercepts. This is just from hearsay. And the mood of the population, I thought this was quite interesting to put in. This is from a V-Man report, an informant report. 85 to 90% friendly to the English, in Heraklion and some German friends. Sentiment against Germany has recently deteriorated significantly due to mainland Greeks complaining about payment with credit notes, i.e. the Germans are buying things and just giving them credit notes, and food shortages on the mainland, where the English, on the other hand, on Crete, are paying in drachmas or pounds. So the people they're basically saying that the locals, the Cretans, are warmed to the British because of the experiences that they're hearing about on the mainland in Greece. Then in November 55, Pissin, I know that's a rude word to say, Paul, and I apologise, but Werner Pissin was a company commander, 6th Company of the Assault Regiment, and he wrote a really interesting report. I recommend anybody read it about the Battle of Crete. It's a really subjective report he wrote for the Allies after the war about Crete. And he also wrote a couple of other documents that are in the archive. And he wrote that it was assumed that the population would show themselves to be friendly to the Germans in order to come to a similarly favourable agreement with the Wehrmacht as on the mainland. This assessment in no way reflected the actual situation in Crete. The population was incited and armed against the Germans. So he's saying that the British incited the Cretes to take up arms to Germany. In fact, they didn't even need inciting to take up arms. It was natural to them because they've done it, you know, they've had hundreds of years of repelling invaders or fighting invaders.
Well, we did the show back a few weeks ago with Kyle Glover about the Cretan resistance later in the war, and you know that understanding we now have of the island nation being somewhat different to the mainland. You get the same thing in Sicily compared to Italy, and it's that independent kind of streak these not small but smaller islands have, where they don't see themselves the same way as the mainland countries do. And it's interesting that the Axis had kind of not picked up on that. They'd not picked up on this idea that the Cretans would be different to the Greeks. It seems logical to me they'd be different. If you know your history, you've got to go back, you've got, as you said, study the history from 1,000 years before, and you'll understand that Crete compared to Greece, Sicily compared to Italy are very different prospects, very different histories.
Well, even the intel reports, all of them have a sort of preamble about the geography and about the history of the island, and it even mentions about their previous history, but nobody seems to have taken any notice. They just grossly misunderestimated the civilian population. Yeah. So the next slide, Paul, is a diary entry by General von Richthofen on the 17th of May, where he says, even today we have absolutely, this is on the 17th of May, obviously, even today we have absolutely no definite information regarding the strength and will to resist the defending force on Crete. And of course, they did also grossly misunderestimate the will to resist from the Allied troops, not just the number, but the fact that they did resist and not just give up. What about the Allies? I know I've talked about German side because it is a German airborne operation, but we have to talk about Crete force. We have to talk about the defending forces under command of General Bernhard Freyberg, who took command at the end of April. Now, so much has been written. You could read 10 books about the Battle of Crete from the Allied perspective, and there's many different versions of how much Freyberg knew about the source of the intel that he was given. The sort of trickle fed to him, if you like, about this is going to happen, this is going to happen at a certain date. Some say that he didn't know the source of it. He believed that it was from a human source and not an electronic source, if you like, and that he had had bad experience with HUMINT in the First World War. I believe it was Gallipoli or somewhere like that, and was almost distrusting of human intel. And also other authors have said that he couldn't believe that the Germans would be able to take the island purely from the air, that it had to be, the main attack had to come from the sea. It had to come against the coast. So he planned for the air assault and also for an amphibious assault on the coast. So the troops on the ground in these sort of dual role positions had one eye in the sky and one eye on the sea. And one example is the sighting of the coastal guns on Hill 107 at Malmö, when elements of the assault regiment landed on the west side out of their, how do you call it? They couldn't fire.
Field of fire. Yeah.
Yeah, they couldn't. They asked for permission to move the guns, but it was denied because they still needed to point towards sea for this expected amphibious assault. Another officer, one of the officers from the 5th Brigade or from Retimo, I believe it was, said that the senior officers only had to walk across the coast and they would see that most places it was inaccessible because to only the shallowest of draft vessels because of the way the coast was. So, but nobody bothered to do that. Nobody bothered to do a full survey of every aspect, every part of the coast where they expected these amphibious assaults to take place.
This comes back to your point earlier, Greg, about Operation Mercury being a series of firsts, because you can understand a British general or an Allied general just not really believing that an invasion can only take place by air. It would have sounded impossible back then. Also, it would have sounded impossible that we were able to break the codes of the Germans and understand what they were communicating to each other. We now accept these facts. We now accept that the British were using ultra and decrypting German communication. But you have to remember there was a time when that would have seemed weird. That would have seemed completely unlikely. So, every invasion in history had always been via the sea. So the fact there's now one solely from the air, we know it happened now, but prior to it happening, it would have seemed impossible.
Yeah, I don't blame him, because many of those senior officers in Grey Force were First World War veterans. Yeah. So they just see warfare as trenches and later on in the war tanks, but just men going over the top and getting killed. Airborne operations were in their infancy, so he only had to go by these smaller operations in May and in Holland and Belgium the previous May. But to take an island from the air, yeah, you're right, absolutely.
Airborne operations have been going on for a year and a half. I mean, since the British have been doing British have been doing their commander operations, but everything has been really quite small and precision, and a few aircraft and a few dozen men doing these insurgent kind of special forces things. This is the first big one where airborne forces are not just a major element, they are the major element. And then, of course, you get Market Guard and Overlord, all that kind of stuff. But yeah, airborne forces have been used, but they've been used for a very specific surgical kind of strikes. Yeah,
exactly. And so to them, it must have seemed, beyond the realm of, I can understand his point of view if you look at it from General Freiburg's point of view, that it has to be subsidized with an amphibious landing. It has to be. If
he had set his defenses up only to worry about an attack by the air and then had something come in by the sea, he'd have been accused of being an idiot first class. What do you mean you ignored the sea approaches? Logics would have suggested you cover all your bases, you cover air, sea, and you just maximize what you've got. We can forgive him, but the crucial thing is I think we need to clarify is the how many forces there actually were on Crete and how many the Germans believe were on Crete, because there's a big difference, and this is where their intel has failed them. It seems to be really good, but it's incomplete. It reminds me of the show we did with David a couple of weeks ago about the Allied intelligence ahead of D-Day, where we didn't just rely on one source. We used aerial photos combined with the code breaking, combined with the checking the coast ourselves from coast, to combine with interrogated German prisoners of war. And from all those sources, you build up a good set of intel. This seems to be too much from a small, one source. Essentially, it's aerial photos and the few bits they're getting from people on the ground. But clearly, it's not giving them an accurate picture.
No, of course, because it was rushed. It was 3.5 weeks of preparation.
And only 3.5 weeks as well, which we should stress.
So the reconnaissance squadrons struggled to find the objectives on the ground because of the weather conditions on Crete in that part of the Mediterranean caused this haze over the landscape, if you like, and it played up terribly with the aerial photography. So they were from the aerial point of view, it was very difficult to find well camouflaged positions on the ground because of the weather condition. But on Crete, like I said before, there's something like they expected a brigade size, with most of them around the Hania and Suda Bay area, and maybe I think that they even believed there was only going to be one company of soldiers at Retimo. So that's probably why they get there and they find out, well, actually this isn't one company, a lot more. You can see the total there, 32,000 British and Commonwealth troops, which is a lot more, almost four times more than what they predicted. And in addition to that, a lot of books say 10,000 Greek troops, but I was reading an article on the internet the other day, somebody recommended to me by a Greek guy called Alexis Matidis, and he stated that 12,000, that's including gendarmes as well, but 12,000 Greek troops. But a third of the Greek forces were unarmed. So out of all those men, a third of them were unarmed. They were poorly equipped. And as the fighting began, weapons in the city areas or in the urban areas, weapons were taken from storehouses. They were breaking in and taking weapons and ammunition out because they were so poorly armed, had a few rounds of ammunition each. Some weapons were coming through from Egypt. I know I'm digressing a bit, but some weapons were coming through from Egypt from captured Italian stocks that were being shipped in and distributed. But mainly the Greeks were using captured German weapons being dropped from the air. They would capture and they would use them themselves. In fact, the German ammunition fitted the Mauser rifles that had been captured in North Africa because they'd been sent with the wrong ammunition. So it seemed to work out. They began fully armed, but they began to arm themselves from captured stocks. So yeah, we got these four groups. I forgot to mention it. Malmö, you've got Malmö and Hania defended by the 2nd New Zealand Division with the 5th Brigade in Malmö, which we'll come to in a minute. Further west, you've just got the Greeks at Castelli, 1st Greek Regiment, who put up one hell of a fight against a small group of paratroopers who jumped at Castelli, which I'll briefly talk about in a minute. You've got the Mobile Naval Base Defence Organisation under General Weston in Suda Bay, which is the port area. Retimo, 19th Australian Brigade. So overall command, Brigadier Vasey, he's further down the coast to the west, but Lieutenant Colonel Commander Campbell is in command in Retimo area. And then the British 14th Infantry Brigade, Brigadier Chappell at Heraklion. And the blue dots represent positions of Greek regiments, Greek battalions that were also there. So like I said, we got 44, some books say 42,000, but if you go by what Alexis Matidis says, that there were 12,000 Greek forces, including gendarmes, we're talking about 44,000 men against the 8,000 men who are going to be dropped on the first day, approximately 8,000 men. And we got to briefly mention transport methods, the U-52, because this was an all-air invasion. Two methods of getting to Crete by air, the U-52 or the DFS 230 glider. So the Junkers 52, workhorse of the Luftwaffe. I think the fleet at this time was about 1,000 units, and that was the most it would ever be for the rest of the war. The workhorse, I said, this tri-motor aircraft, corrugated skin, carry 12 to 13 troops. A lot of U-52s carried 13, some 12. Some went out there with less men on board from different units. And you can see in the top, that's a formation known as a Keta, the three aircraft formation. But the statistics, next slide, Paul, is the most interesting one. Some report, depends what you read. If you read reports from General Conrad from the 8th 11th Flieger Corps transport section, who says I think 493. 11th Flieger Corps itself says 503 operational aircraft on the 20th of May. If we just say there were 500 aircraft available on the 20th of May, and you can see at the bottom at the end of the operation itself, 143 were totally destroyed or not worth the scrap metal value. All right, 8 missing. Although some reports say that only 7 were shot down by flak, but I don't believe it. There had to be more than that shot down and missing. 120 severely damaged. And I've said on the other side that it did have a massive knock-on effect. These losses of over half of that fleet gone. So the numbers had to be made up from the training schools, the pilot training schools, had to provide reserve aircraft for our Operation Barbarossa. So it had a knock-on effect for development of other transport aircraft that they were working on at the time. They had to send men out to recover these aircraft, and they had to be shipped back to Germany, stripped. So it did have a massive knock-on effect, these losses. And the next slide, Paul.
And just also the confidence of airborne operations. I mean, I know we're getting to the end of the battle, but just the Germans are coming into this with essentially everything in May 1940 and early 40 had worked pretty well. They're odd little things that had hiccups, and now after this, confidence in airborne forces, absolutely, it's a punch in the face, isn't it? So it's everything is affected, not just logistically, but in terms of the belief in what airborne forces can achieve.
Yeah, yes, definitely. I mean, not Hitler, but he's student in the 50s, 53, I think he said, Hitler, the Crete came too soon. Because the airborne forces had grown exponentially in the second part of 1940, because of their successes, everyone wanted to be a paratrooper. They're getting the cream of the crop. They were turning away 50% of recruits because they could set the bar so high. But the technology didn't catch up with the amount of men, and it didn't catch up in time for Crete. So they were still using this old transport aircraft, which was a passenger aircraft back in the early 30s. They just didn't have the technology. But the DFS 230, that made its debut back in May 1940 at Eben Emael and the bridges over the Albert Canal, and was their new secret weapon. And carrying 10 men, pilot and 9, 6 facing forward, 4 facing back, 72-foot wingspan. It's light and agile. It's made of steel tubing, lightweight steel tubing, covered in canvas and wooden wings. It was simple and it was effective. But the problem on Crete was the ground was damn hard. These things were designed with special, they were designed to break, if you like, once they hit, to reduce the impact. So they had these break points fitted into them. But even on the Cretan terrain, these things got smashed up, which of course injured, sometimes killed the occupants. So the next slide, Paul, I just threw this in because I thought it'd be quite interesting. These are from two documents that were captured. The Allies captured a hell of a lot of documentation on Crete, which opened their eyes up to the German airborne forces. And it's this booklet here, periodical notes of the German army, which I recommend, if you can get a copy, is to buy it, because it's full of captured German documents from Crete. And these two were captured. These are from 2 of the gliders from the 2nd Company Assault Regiment that landed in the Akrotiri Peninsula, and just goes to show the equipment that they carried in on these 2 particular gliders, the Orth and Rumler gliders. And you can see the amount of explosives, weapons, ammunition, and all the other equipment that glider troops would need, because they are coming out of their glider all ready to fight. They don't have to assemble and find their weapons containers. They've got everything there. They've got the weapons close by, and they've got all this equipment with them to be able to take on their objectives. And it says in the bottom there, the maximum load 1285. If you look at both of those glider loads, one is underloaded and the other one is 0.4 of a kilogram over, but he landed in the end. He wasn't massively overweight. But you can see why these things are also susceptible to ground fire. and they've got, you know, 30 hand grenades on board. The other one has got 81 hand grenades. So, you know, they're also tinderbox.
Yeah.
Right. Next one, point. Yeah, I thought I'd mention this one as well, because the first casualty from the air, if you like, was the commander of the 7th Flieger Division. How ironic is that, that the commander of the division is killed en route to Crete. He, with his staff, or some of his staff members, were used a glider that apparently had been on the ground after being used at Corinth, and it had been on the ground for a week or more, exposed to the elements. Some believe that it weakened in the sun, but he'd also had his pilot replaced. His pilot was a corporal, and he didn't want to be flown to Crete by a corporal. So they brought in an officer called Oberleutnant Krupp, who wasn't as experienced as the corporal. Apparently, when it was being loaded, he was sat in the cockpit and didn't monitor what was going in. So, of course, staff are going to pile in typewriters and fold up tables and bits of paper and things like that. And they kept loading, more than likely overweight in his glider. But as they were being towed to Crete, they were caught in the prop wash of a ankle that went past, and the tow rope snapped. The wing fell off, the second wing fell off, and it cartwheeled down onto the island of Aegina, and he and some of his staff members. So it wasn't a good start for Group Centre, because they lost their commander before he even got on the ground. Next one, I know I'm going to try and put my Richard Burton voice on. This is Bernd Bosshammer, who appears in my book, and we corresponded for quite a while. From 5th Company, 1st Regiment, he dropped in onto the eastern end of the airfield at Heraklion in the afternoon of 20th of May. But on the eve of the battle, he wrote that on the 19th of May, the day before, there was another briefing. Now, for the first time, the word Crete was used. The island of Crete, a place nobody even considered, was suddenly on everyone's lips. Where was Crete? What does it look like? Where do people live there? Which airport is our target? All these questions and more rushed through our minds. The only certainty that we had, that we only had one more sleep and then it would begin. There was an unbearable, feverish tension, and our heads were full of thoughts, but without many answers to all these questions. So that's the day before the invasion. That all these questions coming out of these young paratroopers' minds about what they're going to be doing tomorrow. They're not being told much other than your target is an airfield. It's on the north coast of Crete. That's it. Some I know of one veteran who jumped on the 21st of May with the 3rd wave. He didn't even know he was going to Crete. He thought he was going to Africa, but then they all got together and thought, well, the U-52 wouldn't make Africa from Greece. So, you know, briefing didn't happen around all over with every unit. Some were briefed really well, others vaguely, and some none at all, which seems odd for an operation of this size. And the next slide, we have to mention the fighting abilities of the German Fallschirmjäger, because I know later in the war, you know, Fallschirmjäger, Monte Cassino and Russia, the War Office, in their periodical notes, based on their experiences in Crete and captured documents, but many reports stated that on the whole, parachute troops in Crete were not particularly brave or tough, though individuals showed great courage. They were very young, which is true, the average age 18, 19 amongst the youngsters. Their morale was particularly low during and just after the drop, which is expected because most of these paratroopers came down under fire and weren't able to assemble properly, get to their weapons, etc. Bernard Pissin, who I mentioned earlier, he wrote that with a few exceptions, morale, standard of training, armament and equipment could be regarded as entirely satisfactory. On the other hand, the youthful paratroopers lacked the kind of practical experience which even the best of training courses cannot impart. So like I said before, that they had been laying idle, really. All they had done is training. They had trained. They could land a glider on a sixpence and they could get into as small area as possible. But the problem is their colleagues, their opposite numbers in the army, who had fought through France and through the Balkans, had gained all this combat experience, and they hadn't. All they had was their youth and enthusiasm. He goes on to say, the youthful paratroopers were so eager and so willing to risk their lives that they really ought to have had an older and more cautious corps of mid-echelon leaders to act as a brake and to keep them from indiscriminate foolhardiness. Well, of course, again, the junior NCOs had also never seen combat. because many of them had joined up after the low country operations. So they didn't have this cadre of experience, because not many really, considering that of the whole of the airborne forces, did they have a lot of battle experience guys. You know, only 580 men took part in the operation in Belgium, and a couple of thousand or whatever in Holland. So not everyone had combat experience. And then Kurt Engelmann, who I corresponded with for a few years, he became an instructor for these young lads in 1940 after the Low Countries. And he said, after hard, strict training, the young ones again and again asked, when are we going to see battle? We, the instructors, tried to calm them down, but it was in vain. Nobody thought that on the 20th of May, 1941, most of the young volunteers from the 3rd Battalion would lose their lives, which is true, because I think about 450 from his battalion were killed, and many of them were the youngsters that were so keen to get into battle. And I've put a little bit of Allied input in this. Dan Davin wrote the official history of the New Zealand military in the Second World War, this edition, which is Crete, and it's a fantastic read from the New Zealand perspective on Crete, and I recommend, if you can get a copy, get it. The maps are fantastic and his narrative is fantastic as well. I like Dan Davin, and he was to write on the 20th of May, the sight was inexpressibly sinister, for each man dangling carried a death, his own if not another's. Many found graves where they found earth, and that was so true on the 20th of May. We briefly go through the 20th of May, Group West, because as I said in the beginning, there were 4 operational areas, and within those 4 operational areas was so many independent battles and firefights and written about actions. You know, we could talk for the next week about every single thing that went on in Crete. But the Malmö sector, this is the area where the photographs at the beginning of the show, and I've highlighted that small village Templar there, which looks over towards the airfield, which is just to the northeast of it. So this map is from Davin, and it's a fantastic map. It shows all the contours. You can see the coastal strip. You can see the hills and the ridges and the ravines and the gullies there in contour form. In the red, you've got the positions of the 5th Brigade, the New Zealand 5th Brigade, 22nd Battalion defending the airfield in Hill 107, and then the other elements of 5th Brigade running to the east. The triangles there are planned drop zones and actual drop zones for the gliders and the parachute troops of assault. The most interesting thing is the glider assaults that went in at 715 on the 20th of May. As I said at the beginning, they came in under clouds of dust and smoke because the aircraft, in some cases, the Luftwaffe was still bombing targets on the ground. And the gliders coming in from the south, southeast, southwest were, you know, the visibility was obstructed by this bombing. But only some of them managed to land right areas. East bank, the dry riverbed, around the slopes of 107, and they did take a lot of casualties. Not all the gliders made it to Crete through toe breaks and things like that, but the glider troops that went in did take. But they were shortly followed by the U-2s. The 2 battalions jumped on the west side, and I said before they were in areas that couldn't really be fired on, so they landed really unopposed. And that was another bone of contention, was that the area west of the dry riverbed was undefended. And there had been plans, or it was requested, that the Greek regiment, which was at Castelli, 22 kilometers to the west, should move men in to the west side where it was undefended. But nothing came of that request. So the western side of the dry riverbed was completely undefended. So much of the assault regiment managed to land and assemble and be ready for battle. The 3rd Battalion, unfortunately, though, they jumped east of Malmö. You can see the long triangle, the long rectangular boxes there. They landed right into the position of New Zealand defences that hadn't been identified, well camouflaged, and they were slaughtered. They lost their battalion commander, they lost 3 company commanders out of 4, and the 4th one, who was Rudolf Witzig, was seriously wounded. So all you had throughout the rest of the day, east of Malmö, was just scattered groups. Men keeping their heads down, trying to get back west. It was a lot of losses, particularly with the 3rd Battalion. It was practically decimated, the 3rd Battalion. Because, of course, the 23rd and 21st Battalions there weren't detected, the New Zealand battalions, so they jumped right on top.
It seems to me, Greg, is that with the Germans didn't know that the Allies had as many troops as they did, but then you have the difficulties of getting the gliders to the right place, getting the paratroopers to the right place. It talks about there's a lack of experience in the junior NCOs, things like that. If this is going to stand any chance of working, you're going to have to get your forces at least together, intact, on the ground, in one place, and have leadership there to be able to adapt the situation around it. If you start landing them a few here, a few there, and some get wiped out immediately, you're off to a really, really, really tricky start for this. You know, there is a possibility of it working, because we know that airborne forces can achieve things against superior forces if that first bit starts going okay. But if the first bit doesn't go okay, you're doomed.
Yeah, exactly. And if it also helps if you've got the element of surprise.
Yeah, if they didn't have.
If they know you're coming and their defences are prepared for airborne invasion, then it's not a good start. But yeah, they took heavy losses in Malmö. The 3rd Battalion was there to cut the coastal road and protect, to attack from the east to west towards Malmö, and also defend from any forces coming from the east. But of course, by late morning, they didn't exist. So that ground was still open and still available to the other Allied forces that were there. The next is another veteran account. This is from Kurt Engelmann again, who was with the 10th Company. They landed the furthest east of the 3rd Battalion and were decimated. They lost 68 killed, 1 missing, and 25 wounded out of 140 men. So they took massive casualties. And he said when he got on the ground, from my point of view, the 10th Company drop zone was not suited for a landing at all. Rolling hills and olive groves. Upon touching ground, none of my comrades could be seen, only enemy fire coming in from all directions. Forming a squad or platoon and finding the weapon containers was impossible under heavy fire in that landscape. I crawled up a hill to get an idea about the situation and was hit through the upper leg. But I found 4 other comrades from my company, among them a medic, who dressed my wound. By the end of the day, they'd surrendered because they'd run out of ammunition and it was hopeless, so that they went into captivity. The next one, just quickly look at Hania. This, as I said, this was supposed to be the main area of resistance, where the most Allied troops would be. And so the group Mitte in the first group center in the first wave was to tie down as many troops as possible to prevent reinforcements going west towards Malmö. But you can see again in the picture, the contours, you've got this sort of basin, this valley, which was known as Prison Valley because of the prison halfway down the road there from Hania down to the southwest. And the attack here was preceded by 2 glider assaults. As in the West, gliders were used, the only 2 places where gliders were used. Unfortunately, the Akrotiri Peninsula is not on this map, but I've marked with a dot the sort of approximate location where the gliders of the 2nd Company would land in the Akrotiri Peninsula to neutralise anti-aircraft positions, and the same with Ghent down in the south of Hania, and also take out a radio mast. Altmann's gliders, well, they missed their target for a start. They overflew it, and they were almost at Retimo before they realised their navigational area, and they had enough altitude, luckily, to make a turn and come back in again. But by that time, of course, they were alerted, and they suffered massive casualties, and nobody heard from them again for the rest of the campaign. In fact, 3 of their officers were only 3 of 17 officers who were taken off the island by the Allies. And Ghent to the south, he a bit more successful. He managed to neutralise the anti-aircraft positions, but he couldn't break through to the transmitter. In fact, they had no more success. They had to try and break through to the regiment that had landed down near the prison. So they needed to take the heights around Galatas. Galatas there you can see in almost centre left, which was almost the key to Hania. It was the high ground in front of Hania. And around Galatas to the south, the west, south and southeast were a series of hills, which were important. They had to take the hills, but they were really well defended. And the Germans of the 3rd Regiment, they found themselves stalled at the Galatas Heights. And they would find themselves stalled at the Galatas Heights for the forthcoming few days. They would take a hill, they would lose it, they would attack, counterattack, and it went on. It just went on day after day. Right down in the southwest, you've got the Pioneer Battalion who landed in the vicinity of Alikiano, right down in the bottom left of the photograph of the map. They came under stiff resistance from Greek troops and civilians. And that particular regiment, the Greek 8th Regiment, as you'll see a bit later on, they were instrumental in really preventing a lot of the forces that would evacuate to Slovakia from being captured, because they delayed the mountain troops that were trying to outflank and come around to Suda Bay. So these guys, poorly armed, but they managed to use German weapons that were dropped for them. Sometimes using ground panels to call in airdrops, supplies, and they mainly used German weapons against German paratroopers. They were also joined by a lot of civilians as well, I must say. A lot of civilians joined in the fight. So yeah, the 3rd Regiment, they had difficulties. They suffered heavy losses, particularly the 3rd Battalion was scattered on approach by anti-aircraft fire that hadn't been neutralized by the glider. But again, they was very optimistic to break through to Gentz's gliders. They couldn't get through. There was no way on day one they were going to get through to Hania. It was hoped they'd get to Hania, capture the because this is the capital. They would capture the administration, and that's it. It would be over. That the British would withdraw and evacuate. And it was very optimistic. But as I said, they were stalled at Alikiano in the southwest and stalled on the Galatas Heights, and bottled up in that valley, in Prison Valley.
Just a question, Phil Blood is asking a question. I'm going to word it slightly differently. We're looking at this map now where we can see the Greek positions, the British positions, the German positions. How much knowledge did each little pocket of Germans have of where the other pockets of Germans? What about radio communications? What other means of communication did they have to know where the situation was going around them?
For company to battalion to regiment, you had backpack radios. The big problem on Crete was the bigger radio sets, so the 80-watt sets, the 200-watt sets, many of which were damaged because they couldn't be parachuted in. They were brought either in by glider, for example. So as we move on to Retimo, they had no radio contact with Retimo for the whole of the battle because their radio set had been damaged. In most places, they could talk between companies and battalion HQ, but their lack of intel, and they believed that units weren't going to be in a certain place. So, for example, trying to break through to Perivolia there to get through to Gentz's gliders, well, they couldn't because of stiff resistance. Remember that a lot of their supplies were lost in the undergrowth. That whole Prison Valley, when you stand there, it's surrounded. It seems quite small, and you enclosed by the hills and the mountains around you. I've not got a photograph. I wish I had now, but it's quite a small area. A lot of undergrowth at the time with a rocky base. A lot of the weapons containers were lost. Even though a lot of the troops in the 3rd Regiment were able to assemble and carry out the attack, they started to lose a lot of officers as well during the day. So that broke down cohesion of the attacks as well. The fact that the command in general had been killed. So Heydrich had to also take command of the division. So he's trying to make decisions now for the whole division and his regiment. And apparently, from a command point of view, he was quite a harsh commander, and I think a lot of mistakes were made. But again, resistance, trying to take the Galatas Hills that first day, they couldn't do it. They could not get into Galatas. There was no way they were going to get into Galatas. No way they were going to get to Hania on that first day. It wasn't so much communication. It was resistance. It was poor decision making on Heydrich's account and scattered groups. You know, trying to bring them cohesively together.
And do we know if they obviously have their primary objectives, but do we know if they have any kind of contingency plans that if you can't get to objective A, instead hold position B? You know, is it all or nothing, or are they improvising? You know, on their just on the fly in the battlefield, so to speak?
Yeah, they all had their objectives. Like I said before, they were really optimistic objectives. So, for example, here in Hania, when Heydrich realised that he's not going to get Galatas that day, in the afternoon, he when they finally got their 200 watt radio going, they managed to get communications with Athens, where the HQ was. He even requested that the 2nd Regiment be sent to him and not to Retimo, because he didn't feel he had enough forces to break through the cordon of Allied forces that were stopping him from getting through, because his route to Hania was blocked in the centre and blocked in the around the Galatas Heights. So, but he was turned down. He didn't get any air support during the day either. He didn't get any ground attack. So he decided that he would just take the defensive and fully assemble his troops and get them ready, perhaps for another counter attack the following day. So it was very difficult because of the resistance that came across, disjointed units, and poor verbal communication from Heydrich.
Yeah, thanks for answering. So, between waves now.
Between waves, yeah, of course, the first wave has gone. They've got to get ready for the second wave. So some of the aircraft returning from the first wave were damaged because they'd come under attack from anti-aircraft fire, machine gun fire. So there were some crash landings at the airfields in Greece, which of course had a knock-on effect because they had to be towed to the edge of the airfield. Delayed landing then of the further aircraft coming in, creating these massive dust clouds as well because of this powdery sand. The airfields were improvised, as I said, and there was no time to make them perfect. So every time an aircraft took off, it created these massive dust clouds. Less aircraft for the second wave, so some men had to stay behind from the second wave regiments, but most of all, it was poor coordination between the aircraft support units and the 11th Flieger Corps carrying the paratroopers. So it was a strict timetable. They couldn't really deviate from this timetable. The coordination between the air assault and the fire support from the Luftwaffe. So of course, the aircraft who were the dive bombers and the fighters, etc., left earlier before the second wave were ready to leave, which would have a serious knock-on effect. And Rutger von Haking, who was one of the commanders of one of the transport units, said that the airfields were deserts in which the heavily laden aircraft sank up to their axles in fine powdery sand. Whenever an aircraft took off or landed, it was enveloped in clouds of dust rising as high as 3,300 feet and hanging over the airfield in the dry heat of windless valleys. So it delayed, instead of 1 minute between takeoff, it was delayed 2-3 minutes. So the whole of the second wave was disjointed. They weren't flying together. They were flying in smaller groups. So that would have a knock-on effect when they got to their objectives. So we look at Retimo. Retimo and Heraklion in the second wave, very similar stories, that they were unable to assemble. The second regiment here, for example, was under strength. They were under strength on battalion because they had been sent to Heraklion. And what you have at Heraklion is this narrow coastal strip overlooked by terraced hills that are covered in vineyards and olive groves, bisected by dried rivers, ravines and gullies. Easy place for containers to be lost, for men to be separated. They dropped into well camouflaged positions, man. 2 Australian and 2 Greek battalions with the drop zone dominated by enemy fire. So it wasn't good from the start. So they suffered heavy losses. The air support had already left and hadn't really done much damage, the same as Heraklion, to be honest. And so the aircraft took some losses. The men took losses when they got on the ground. They couldn't assemble. They were unable to break into the town of Retimo. They were unable to take the airstrip. They did capture a hill near the airfield, but they lost it again the next morning. They captured a hill, Chapel Hill, you can see marked on the map. They took that, and between there and the village of Perivolia on the coast, that became their defensive positions for almost the rest of the battle at Retimo. Their radio had been damaged. They had no contact with Athens. They had no contact with the outside world. So obviously they believed in Athens that they'd been completely destroyed, and they took a lot of losses, something like 500 men killed in the first day. And over the next few days, about 500 POWs were taken.
Wow.
And Sebastian Krug was supposed to jump with the 2nd Regiment at Retimo, but he said that not all of the U-52s returned from the first wave. Some that did return were badly damaged. We were supposed to start at 1,300. It was actually about, about 1,500, 1,300. But not all the men could go due to the lack of aircraft. I was very sorry that I wasn't going with them. Maybe it was luck that I did not jump with my company, because none of the officers and very few NCOs survived. Most of them were killed in the air by heavy ground fire. Out of 156 men who jumped, 140 of them now lie in the cemetery at Malmö, including the commanding officer. I don't think his figures I think his figures are a little bit out, but they did take massive casualties jumping on the airfield there, the airstrip. It was overlooked by hills, and they came under fire as they came down. And the next one, Heraklion, I'd just like to say that I got a friend of mine who's Cretan. He's the first person to write about the actual Battle of Heraklion and not focus on Malmö, which became the main focus of the battle. Fantastic book, published in 2017. Massive research gone into it, and it goes into the battle for this one area, which nobody else has done, in great detail. I highly recommend it. So I get that plug in for him, because it is a fantastic book. But Heraklion, the second wave, this is the last of the drops during the 20th of May. The 1st Regiment didn't have a really good start, because they had to leave. Some sources say 450, some say 600 men behind, because they just didn't have the aircraft then during the 2nd wave to take them. And what you have at Heraklion, you have this walled city, these huge Venetian walls surrounding the town and its harbour facilities, an airfield about 2 kilometres to the east on the coast, overlooked by hills, a slight depression on the eastern end of the airfield, but again, hills dominating the airfield. It's the largest of the runways on the island, and the actual overall commander for this sector wasn't Bruno Breuer, it was General Ringel, the commander of the 5th Mountain Division, because it was planned as soon as this airfield was taken, optimistically, that as soon as it was taken, they would start air landing the 5th Mountain at Heraklion, at the airfield at Heraklion. But again, of course, it didn't work, because the 2nd wave timetable was seriously disrupted. Limited air cover. In fact, most of the aircraft had already either low on fuel and had turned around. So, of course, as the slow lumbering U-52s came in, the Allies on the ground had recovered from the bombing, which didn't cause much damage anyway, uncovered their guns and started pounding away. Some of them from the hills, which were almost at the same height as the U-52s coming in. So it was a slaughter in some areas. You know, the guys that jumped, the men that jumped outside the city walls were decimated. Elements that jumped on the east and western side of the airfield were decimated. They had armored vehicles, mortars, artillery. They hit them with everything, and they took massive losses. They were unable to penetrate the town. Some of them did get inside the wall, but they were forced to withdraw outside the city limits. It was a disjointed approach. I think from start to finish, the airdrops took over 2.5 hours from west of the city, where the 2nd Battalion, the 2nd Regiment had landed to protect the western flank, to several kilometres to the east to take a radio station out in Gornes, right at the east there, the box in the east. And of course, the town itself of Heraklion the defence was given to Greek troops. there were some reinforcements available, British reinforcements. The British and Australian forces at Heraklion were mainly centered around the airfield area. But the Greek troops give the Germans hell, you know, when they came down outside the city walls, or those that jumped inside the city walls, assisted by civilians. They were forced to withdraw from both objectives. They were forced to withdraw outside the city limit, you know, the city walls, and in the depression east of the airfield. Just murderous. The first. And Bern Bosshammer, again, he jumped into Heraklion at 1730 hours. The island of Crete came into view. At 1750, there's sudden flak and MG fire. I'm last to jump. The platoon leader is first. In front of me is Corporal Rudolf Suttner. He was from a prominent family, Austrian family from Vienna, who does not want to leave the aircraft. He stands up in the door and collapses. I push him out of the door and jump behind him. I'm shocked by the deployment of my parachute, and my machine pistol flies over my head and my whole face is bleeding. I make a bad landing in a vineyard. I loosen off my harness and wash the blood from my face. From all sides, we come under fire. In fact, Corporal Suttner was shot in the heart while he was stood in the door of the aircraft, getting ready to jump. Just a lucky shot, I suppose, from the ground. And he crumpled in the door, and Bern Bosshammer kicked him out. His body was found later. Just want to quickly go through some more operational impediments or handicaps to the troops, just to get away from the dry facts about the battle and things like that. Uniforms, Paul, on the next one. All books, when they talk about Crete, they always mention a sentence that says, yeah, they jumped the same uniforms they jumped in the Narvik, where in 1940. And yeah, we know that. But I'm interested in comparisons between units in how they looked at uniforms. So, for example, the Fallschirmjäger Abteilung, which was one of the divisional units of 7th Flieger Division, had really, I think I said this on that show about the photograph, strict dress regulations. So certain items had to go in certain pockets, and they have certain items on their body. 2 bread bags they carried. I don't know about other units whether they carried 2 bread bags, but 1 for rations, 1 for weapon cleaning kit. You know, very strict. Only trusted individuals carried egg grenades. You know, a private couldn't carry an egg grenade. He had to be a junior NCO and above. And they had regular inspections prior to the operation. But the assault regiment, on the other hand, I only came across this the other day about an oral brief, and oral brief was given to the men on easy marching. So that's mutilating the uniform to suit the climate, because Eugen Meindl, General Meindl, was really wary about or aware of the terrain and the temperature. This is subtropical temperature, and paratroops hadn't fought in that before. You know, these young lads had never been abroad, let alone in the subtropics, and they're going into with woolen uniforms. You know, I've got one here. It's thick wool, like the British battle dress. You know, thick wool.
and tight round the collar, isn't it? A lot of their stuff is always very restricted. There's no ability for air to get out. I remember that from the German stuff in my reenactment days. Not that I wore it myself, but that you just get hot and there's nowhere to breathe, is it?
No, exactly. The rayon lining as well. The sweat just sticks to it and sticks to your body. And on top of that, of course, you've got your Springer combination, or your jump smock, your Noschen sack, your bone sack, whatever you want to call it. Because, you know, I know some of the men used to say that when they were in the air, go into Crete, all the doors and hatches on the U-52 were open to get a blow through to cool them down, because it was just so hot, even in the air. But the assault regiment said that they could remove their Flieger Blues if they wanted, or discard their Springer combination when they got on the ground to suit the climate, because otherwise they're going to overheat, or cut the legs off the trousers to create shorts. But that was that problem was resolved with captured clothing stocks in Crete. You'll see lots of photographs, particularly after the battle, of German paratroopers wearing British tropical shorts. Karl-Heinz Goller, in fact, alludes to the fact that there was tropical clothing available, and it was in storerooms in store warehouses in Romania and Bulgaria, but there wasn't enough time to issue it. And I don't know how true that is. I've never read anything like that before. But anyway, they could butcher their uniform as they saw fit. It wasn't a written order. It was just an oral briefing, but they had to preserve their rank, obviously, when they were on the ground. Like I said, it wasn't ordered. It was just left to the discretion of the men. And I know from other veterans that as soon as they hit the ground, they took off their sweaters. The men were wearing sweaters. They took off their Flieger blues and they just wore, you know, they were naked on the top with just their bone sack over the top of that, you know, sleeves rolled up just to try and ventilate themselves a bit better in the heat.
Which makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Parachutes, right? The RZ-16 parachute was the most common used in Crete. And the RZ-20 was used in limited numbers. And if I remember rightly, Bruno Breuer, the commander of the 1st Regiment, went into battle wearing a RZ-20 parachute. But basically, all I want to say is because parachutes, we talk about parachutes all day, much written about the poor design of the parachutes. Because you can see in the photograph on the left, which I don't think this photograph's been seen very often because it's off the front cover of an old DDF magazine from the 50s. But you can see where the riser assembly is attached. It's attached to the belly band of the harness on the sides. So it rides about hip height. So if you can imagine jumping out of the aircraft and the canopy is open and you've got the riser assembly, as you can see in the photo on the right, you're going to be, once the canopy is opened, you're going to be at a slight angle coming down, which required the jumper then to adopt landing on all fours. That's why they practice forward rolls and backward rolls a lot. And this sort of landing, particularly if you're trying to fight to get into the wind prior to landing, made carrying weapons difficult. So obviously they were vulnerable. We'll come on to carrying the weapons in a minute, basically. So that hence the need for containers to carry small arms in, or the majority of small arms and other light weapons, machine guns and mortars. But the biggest thing for Crete was the harness. So the harness on the RZ-16 was a buckle type affair, had to be wrapped around so you got no loose ends and things. And it took over 60 seconds to remove that harness, whereas the RZ-20 took about 10 seconds because it was a quick release. But I did read a few years ago, and some people might say this is absolute rubbish, and it was a reason why the parachute was that it wasn't a rubbish design. It was actually fit for purpose, and that's because this was a static line operated parachute where the canopy would open after about 30 meters, approximately 30 meters. I know someone will say 31. From as low an altitude as possible, so the minimum altitude is 80 meters. Some of the jumpers on Crete jump from 70 meters. You know, if you can imagine the canopy opening after 30 meters and you're falling at 6 or 7 meters per second, you're going to be on the ground in a few seconds. And that was the whole idea. It was to get men like this guy in the photograph who's observing the Reichensprung principle, which was designed by a German in the 30s, which is spring hook on a central wire, all closed up by the door, jumping out one after the other to as quick as possible and then landing in as small an area as possible. But if you gave them a parachute where you had double risers and you were able to give them some sort of influence over landing, would you still get that grouping on the ground? Whereas if they all jump out and none of them have got any sort of ability to influence the direction of their parachute, they're just exposed to the elements, the wind, would you still get that tight group? You know, so that was one theory that was bandied around years ago in an article I read about 15 years ago. Which I
we need to remember as well, Greg, that this is still parachuting is in its infancy, isn't it? All the armies are still developing techniques, and now, and not that we particularly use airborne forces in this kind of large way, but we've been parachuting for 7 decades now, so everything has been refined and improved. The harness design, the buckle design, the risers, the deployment from aircraft are now designed around the paratrooper in some ways, whereas these are all paratroopers fitted to aircraft. As you said, the door, people said in the sidebar, the door of the U-52 is not ideally, for the jumping. So everything is a compromise, isn't it, at this point in the war?
Yeah, definitely, absolutely right. Yeah, like I said, the door on a U-52 on the port side aft was great for small paratroopers, but for tall guys, they're almost on their knees jumping out, squatting to take the diving jump. And somebody asked me the other day, why do they dive out of the aircraft and not jump? Well, again, that's all down to the riser assembly and where it's located. If they were to jump out normally like Allied paratroopers, then you could imagine when the canopy opened, they're going to be flipped upside down and their legs might get tangled up in the in the webbing lines. Plus, it was all to do with the prop wash as well. So yeah, anyway, but that bottom line there, the success or failure of a parachute landing lies exclusively in the hands of the absetzer, or the dispatcher, the guy that, you know, who sends them out of the aircraft, which they still have now, of course. But this was from an 11th Flieger Corps report. And this is right, many of the jumps, incorrectly jumped or scattered jumps, were due to the fault of the absetzer. There was an investigation after about the training of the absetzer, because when the Fallschirmjäger units had to send men away for training, they didn't send their best men, because if they sent their best men, they're going to spend the rest of their life in the back of a U-52 and not on the ground fighting. So they used to send the guys who were in trouble, or the moaning mini, the sick bay ranger. They'd send him off for absetzer training. And of course, the absetzer you'd think would be a Luftwaffe aircrew, but he's not. He's a paratrooper, failed or not. You know, he has no idea about aircraft operations. And so one of the things after Crete was the training of absetzer. The dispatchers changed as well, so it became more comprehensive, a bit more coordinated with the Luftwaffe aircrew, as opposed to just being a paratrooper going, yeah, lights on, by, and they jump out of the aircraft. You know, it was thinking about what's below you, what's around. Like the drop containers, Paul, the next one. Yeah, not going to too much about drop containers. We've said why there was a need for drop containers, because of the way that the parachute opened, and coming down on all fours necessitated your hands and feet to be clear. But in Crete, you know, over 5,000 of them we used. Many of them lost in vegetation, gullies, you know, under cover, fallen into enemy positions and used against them. That was one of the major problems with canisters. Plus the fact that in canisters, and also men, they carried ground markers. And once it was realized that if you laid this out on the floor and a U-52 comes over and drops four containers out of its ESAC tubes, its bomb shafts, great. I not only am I getting weapons and ammunition, I'm getting mortars, I'm getting all sorts. So, you know, they hindered the assembly of the paratroops on the ground, not just getting out of the harness, but also then getting the weapons containers if they are unlucky enough not to be armed with an MPI when they jump. The next photo, Paul, is a photograph of one group, 13 guys, ready to embark their U-52 prior to flying to Heraklion, west of Heraklion, 2nd Battalion, 2nd Regiment, 8th Company under Oberfeld Wabel Pill, Senior NCO. Somebody said to me the other day, hang on a minute, they all got weapons. That must be, you know, 13 groups together, Senior NCO photograph or something. Well, it's not, because I know two of the veterans in that photograph who were corporals at the time. But you can see about, I think it's 11 out of 13 of them are carrying MPIs. So some books will say only the group leader and a deputy group leader in each aircraft carried them, but the captured regimental orders from the 3rd Regiment states that battalions will detail forward platoons in which a sufficient number of men will jump with their machine carbines, their battle pistols, a camp pistol. So this is a good example of how many men in this particular aircraft were going to jump with machine pistols. So they would be ready on the ground once they got out their parachute harness. Or in some cases, these accounts of men coming down in their chutes, spraying the ground with their MPIs, which, yeah, may or may not. So yeah, and you can see the kit there, that they've got their helmets on, so they must be ready to go. As opposed to the next photograph, Paul, which is an unknown group from the 1st Regiment. And don't shoot me, because I'm only saying what the caption said on eBay. This photograph went for about 450 euros, mate. This is ridiculous. The photographs now being sold, particularly airfield photographs in Greece prior to the invasion. I got a copy from the seller because I thought I recognized one of the veterans in it, and he sent me a high def copy. But you can see that, unlike paratroopers today, where everything's worn on the outside, or in World War II, you know, the American paratroopers, everything's on the outside. With the Fallschirmjäger, everything was on the inside. Everything was underneath the bone sack to prevent anything snagging. And you can see the bulges. Some of these guys have got massive bulges out the back of their bone sacks, at the front, the gas mask bags at the front by their chest straps. You know, these guys, they're not even armed. I can't see any weapons on any of these guys. They'd have sidearms. So everything beneath the bone sack. So you've got your cookware, your your bread bags, your water bottle, your map case, your holster, everything is underneath. So you can imagine coming down to land and how vulnerable you are, because once you've on the ground, you've got to get out of your parachute harness, which may take 10 seconds or it may take over a minute. Then you've got to rip off your bone sack to get to your pistol, your holstered pistol, or egg grenades, or whatever you've got, defense weapons, before you can then get to your container to get your weapons out. So hence why many men were found shot in their harnesses, because they've been killed while struggling out, or trying to find their containers to get more firepower.
It's fascinating because it brings up that whole what that debate about, would you rather have time to get yourself sorted out on the ground and get your weapons, get your stuff out, your canister off your body, whatever it was, or would you rather be ready to, because every operation Allied and Axis has different problems. We talk so much about the paratroopers on D-Day and Normandy being lost, but so many of them landed and had time to get themselves sorted out. They could ditch the kit they didn't need, take a breath, work out where they are, adjust their kit from the jump to walking about on the ground, and then you go off and find your men and start engaging in battle. And again, an occasion like this, when you're being shot at in the sky, there's no ideal way of going into war as a paratrooper. It's always, again, it's compromise, isn't it? Do you want to have the stuff with you, or do you want to run to it? Do you want to be ready to go? But basically what I'm trying to get to is those first 5 minutes on the ground, or even the first minute, is absolutely vital to where the success is going to go. If you're there intact, you've got a fighting chance of getting to your objective. But yeah, the margins are very fine, aren't they?
I mean, they were hoping that that they knew they'd lost the element of surprise for Crete, because the RAF was bombing the airfields in southern Greece. They had seen the build-up of aircraft on the airfields. They'd seen the ships on the south coast for the 2 sea squadrons. So they knew that they'd lost the element of surprise. So they were then hoping that the Luftwaffe would be able to bomb these targets into submission, and just before the jump would keep their heads down and demoralize them. But it didn't.
Which becomes even, as you said, becomes even more vital on the second lift. Because the second lift, when you absolutely have no surprise, you absolutely need that coordination between your airstrike capability, your paratroopers, so that you can just maybe keep the heads of the enemy down when you actually bring your men in. But if, as you said earlier, if the support from the Luftwaffe is coming too early or too late, the disaster is just there.
Exactly. You need the time to assemble, and that's it. If you don't have it, then you're going to take losses because no one's armed. Right, water was a big problem. Obviously, heat stroke, dehydration, dysentery. Every company doctor was, as well as his medical duties, was responsible for ensuring that the men had clean water. There was distinct lack of purification tablets taken with them, and they had a backpack filter device, hand-operated filter device, to filter water. I've never seen one. If anybody knows of one, please send me a photograph. Of course, wells and streams provided water at that time of the year, what little water they could get from wells and streams. So a lot of men drank water raw, because the subtropical temperature, the clothing they were wearing, it just took it out of them. But don't forget that the Allied troops had become acclimatized. Those that had been on Crete for a while had acclimatized to the heat, the food, the rations were better. We talk about them, and they knew where to get water from. And when they weren't on duty, they were in the towns drinking wine, and they acclimatized. Whereas these guys,
and that's a very good point, Greg, because that's come up on World War II TV so often. You look at the British Army in Burma in the early part of the war, even the early Chindic columns to the later part of the war. We did the show about the Alamo Scouts, how they were training and getting prepared for combat in exactly the same terrain and climate as where they would be going into combat. So you're in the zone, you're in the place, and the fact that these guys are coming from a long way away before and it's only been 3 weeks of plan. There's no time. You just get as you say, get your body adjusted to the climate, just that oppressive heat. It's like when you arrive on, go on vacation or holiday to Sicily or Malta. That first day, you're just kind of getting used to the temperature. Then by day 4 or 5, you're starting to get the swing of it. But it's the same thing for people in the war, except exaggerated because of the fact they've got to fight a battle.
Yeah, exactly. And it was important that one side is acclimatized and know how to fight. And of course, in Crete, Werner Pisson recorded the temperature. He said it was something like 32 degrees on the 20th of May 1941. And in the evening, the temperature dropped quite quickly. So men that had stripped off during the day then became very cold at night, and they're sort of wrapping themselves up in parachute canopies and things like that. And they're all literally hanging out because they've drunk all their tea or their coffee or the water that they had in their flasks. So of course that they would go out looking for wells, and refill their bottles, fill their helmets up, and throw it over them, whatever. Some guys, most houses had barrels of wine in. Of course, the drinking that soon became banned when men were found drunk, because subtropical, you drink, you get drunk quicker.
Yeah, if you're hot, you're tired, and then you're having alcohol, it's just a recipe for disaster, isn't it? Yeah. I've said the word disaster about 10 times during this show. It's the ingredients. Yeah.
You're not far off. You're not far off disaster. The other thing, rations. They went with limited rations, 3-day rations, 2 fatty, 2 salty. Every veteran mentioned about the rations that were absolutely awful, that made you even more thirsty because of the salt. And of course, the heat. These rations weren't designed for the heat. They just turned into this horrible porridge in their bread bags, you know. And it was inedible. Guys were getting sick from eating it. On the right there is just like a receipt for rations. Just to give you an idea of what the contents of 3 rations. This is 1941. I know they changed during the war, but tinned foods like sausage, hams, and bacon, chocolate like like Coca-Cola. This is the modern Coca-Cola, so it's just chocolate with caffeine in, you know, just to give energy and things like that. Crisp breads, which were lovingly referred to as armor plates because they were practically inedible as well. Tartaric acid sugar, which came in candy form just to give energy. I still haven't found out what thirst quenchers are. I've just bought 2 books on Wehrmacht rations, and I still can't find out what thirst quenchers are. And of course, the obligatory cigarettes. But yeah. Fred Kranefeld, his quote there, lovely guy, he lived in Canada after the war, and he said they used to subsidize their food rations with olives. They were sick to death of olives by the end of the battle. And of course, British rations, because British rations didn't just melt into a porridge. Things like bully beef and corned beef and things like that last for years on the surface of the sun, you know. So they would use booty food found in tented camps and things like that to subsidize their rations, because they were starving as well as thirsty. I know everyone's going to say but you know, from Fallschirmjäger point of view, that's all. The next one is intro. I get asked quite often about drugs and being doped. It
came up in the sidebar about 10 minutes ago, Greg. There was a conversation about that, because there was that kind of revelation a couple of years of that documentary in the UK, wasn't it, about the doped up Germans, and it's now become a big discussion point. So yeah, I'm interested to get your perspective on this.
Pervitin, or Stuka tablets as they used to be called. The War Office, in their book from captured documents, they stated that parachute troops are not doped, but the following drugs are used: Enogen or dextroenogen. Used to in casino, they called them when they were airdrop supplies, grape sugar, which was the same as dextroenogen, just to give them that little bit of energy. White tablets, and then Pervitin, of course, a drug allied to benzodrine, which is a oh my god, what's it called again? It's a, I can't remember the type of
stimulant.
I can't remember. No, yeah, well, it is a kind of stimulant, yeah, to produce wakefulness and alertness. It is said to make one thirsty. Now, I did ask 1 or 2 veterans about Pervitin, and they didn't take it. It was available, and some guys had it, but it wasn't issued. They bought it, whether you got it at a chemist or whatever, they had it on them. But those that did take it didn't take it more than once because of the intense thirst, and they didn't have enough water then. But Werner Pissin, this is quite funny. He reported that this Australian war correspondent had written, dead German paratroopers had turned a vivid green a few hours after death. Obviously, they had been given narcotics. An Australian tried the stuff and experienced a feeling of euphoric enthusiasm and had to be restrained from attacking an enemy emplacement on his own. So that's quite outrageous, isn't it? That these paratroopers, dead paratroopers, had turned vivid green. Perhaps you know, the dead paratroopers are going to turn a vivid black and bloated, but I don't know about green. But Pissin then went on to state that this was not based on fact, and it was used to combat tiredness and prevent air sickness. Apparently, it was used as a trial for paratroopers going to Crete regarding air sickness. So that's what Pissin states. But like I said, yeah, some paratroopers took it, but once it was realised how thirsty it made them in that subtropical climate with hardly any water anyway, it was just stopped. Those few that probably took. So yeah, we talk about drugs. Can't say much more about drugs and doping other than what's on there. But I've never heard anything about dead paratroopers vivid green because they've been doped with some super drug to keep them.
It sounds like bollocks to me, if I'm being honest. Yeah.
Turn them into super soldiers because the amount of losses they had, then obviously that drug didn't work, whatever it was. And yeah, Franz Rosea, we're talking about wells and gullies, sources of water became targets once the Allies realised that they didn't come with much water, they didn't come with much supplies. They would target with MGs, mortars, snipers, in particular, gullies and water sources. And Franz Rosea, he jumped on the 21st of May in the afternoon, and his company was literally slaughtered as well, only a handful of survivors. And he went on to say, at the bottom of the hill, we spotted a gully. 2 comrades tried to reach this water hole, taking our water bottles with them. We could see them at the watering hole drinking, and then they filled up the water bottles and also their jump helmets. Then it happened. Suddenly we heard shots and saw both of them fall and topple into the gully. And he was playing cat and mouse with that sniper until it got dark when he could move away. There was somebody out there watching and shooting, and he couldn't find them. And it was only darkness when he could break off, you know, to protect himself. Like the turning point. Are we all right for time here, Paul? Are we?
We're 2 hours in, but yeah, I think we shouldn't go on more than another 20 minutes or so. But yeah, but it's good. I mean, people are enjoying it, and in fact, viewing numbers went up in the last 20 minutes. It sounds good. Keep going. We're fine.
Yeah, my mouth's as dry as the surface of this chair. Right. Anyway, the turning point, 20th over to 21st. A lot has been written about this and the actions of Lieutenant Colonel Command. The 22nd Battalion and 5th Brigade New Zealand troops that were at Hill 107 and Malame airfield. Right, they'd had a hell of a day. The Germans had a hell of a day, and the New Zealanders had a hell of a day. My mouth's so dry, Paul. There'd been a failed counter attack.
I'll talk for a bit. You have a sip of water. I'll talk.
That's all right. I got it. So we're not going to be 4 hours. So the New Zealanders had put in a counter-attack in the afternoon against German forces, but it had failed. Right, it was a platoon of soldiers, a couple of tanks. It didn't go down too well. Lieutenant Colonel Andrew, he'd started to lose communication with his forward companies. He'd already informed the brigade commander of his intentions. The situation's not good, and then came back the old famous reply: "If you must, you must." But he was going to send 2 companies as reinforcements. They sort of got lost and couldn't find a way and became delayed and got caught up with stragglers to the east of them. Old Leslie Andrew, he knew that there were paratroopers on the slopes. He knew that they could attack at any time. The Luftwaffe at daybreak on the 21st, they're going to come pounding his positions. So he had to make that painful decision that only commanders can do, and he withdrew from his positions on Hill 107. And then during the night, as it was discovered that he disappeared, the rest of his men who weren't dead or captured, a lot of them were still in their positions and still up for a fight, but they started to withdraw as well. So what you see then is come the morning, paratroopers are thinking, well, why aren't we under fire? And they cautiously climb up the slopes of Hill 107 and move across the airfield and find that there's nobody there to attack them, or there's no opponent. So that was the turning point, because then, of course, Hill 107, you could see there, and the airfield are in German hands. The New Zealand forces had moved further east. There were still quite a few guys, New Zealand troops in and around Pyrgos and things, but all in all, the area was in German hands, and that was the most important thing to student in Athens, because before this turning point happened, he'd already worked out a plan. He knew that an airfield had to be taken. The news was grievous from Crete during the day. All he knew was high casualty rate. He knew that none of the objectives had been taken on the first day. He knew that he had no communications with Retimo. So it was just one disaster after the other. So he decided to plan, we've got to get an airfield. He knew they had a foothold on the airfield here at Malmö and on the hill. Right, let's turn the focus of attention at Malmö. He started planning for a third wave of drops on the 21st of May. And of course, once news came in the morning of the 21st, that enthused him more. And that's when he got the wheels in to start bringing the mountain troops in, right, on the 21st. So I just want to read the bit about this veteran from the 3rd Company, Fallschirmjäger Abteilung, when they dropped in the early morning. This is part of the 3rd wave that landed on the morning of the 21st of May as reinforcements, as part of this plan for an attack at 1500 hours. Troops land into the east, troops land into the west, and they would converge on what New Zealand forces were in between and crush them so they could take full control of the whole area. So he drops 0745. They move to Tavernitis, which is on the west side of the dry riverbed. And he says that the hamlet of Tavernitis looked bad. Along the road lie countless wounded and dying from both sides. Doctors and medics perform superhuman feats using insufficient supplies. In the open houses, we see temporary operating tables and candlelit wound care. For us young soldiers on our first mission, these were shocking images. Right, the assault regiment was in a massively bad way that morning. And it says, you know, in the top, when they came across the first Stern assault regiment guys, they said, "Good that you came, but everything here is lost. There are no more companies. Everyone's fighting on their own." They were in a really bad way on the morning of the 21st. But some of their comrades had already walked over the top of Hill 107, and it's empty. So that was the start then of the German victory. And the disempowerment of student. I will mention it, Paul, because Egon Schiele, German writer, refers to it as the disempowerment of student, where command was taken away from him of the operation and given to General Ringau. And you could read 15 books, and there's all different versions if it's mentioned at all. You know, due to the fact the operation is not going as planned, it's going to have a knock-on effect for morale in Germany if they're told about these losses. In fact, the public weren't told about Operation Mercury until the 25th of May, once it started to swing more in the Germans' favour.
Yeah.
And of course, if you remove student from the whole operation, then it's going to have an impact on morale on the paratroopers that are already on the ground. So he intended to fly in on the 22nd. But Yeshenek and some of the other hawks that were circling him because of his failures on the first day, you know, he'd silenced his critics a year before, but he couldn't do it. They were circling him, and Göring then sent a signal saying that he should remain in Athens and not fly to Crete until further notice. And some of the reasons were that he still had 3 other regiments on the ground. They still needed resupply and reinforcement, and it would better for him to conduct those operations from Athens. But there's lots of other reasons. And as soon as he was told, not long after he was told, then General Ringel, the commander of the 5th Mountain Division, was given operations on the ground, and he flew out on the 22nd. Student wasn't allowed to fly out until the 25th, when, you know, there was some major successes. And then basically he just did a tour of the island as the troops were moving eastward. Right, so quick one. We've established that the 21st was the turning point, and I just cruised through this, all right, because what we're seeing now from late in the afternoon is the landing of mountain troops to reinforce the assault regiment after the daytime landings of the 3rd wave. Some of it was unsuccessful. Some of them were decimated east of Malmö, but they managed by the evening to start landing mountain troops. They'd also taken by late evening Malmö and Pyrgos, and they'd secured that area and started to push the Allies back. And for the next days, they then start bringing in mountain troops. They bring in the field hospital. They bring in everything through Malmö airfield still under artillery fire, of course, and that's where a lot of the aircraft losses are sustained, is because they were still within range of New Zealand artillery further east, which wasn't silenced, I think, the 23rd. So what we have, there's a failed counterattack on the 22nd by Allied forces from Platanius. Right, they managed to get as far as the airfield. They managed to get as far as the south slopes. But of course, by that time, so many troops have been reinforced on, brought in on the ground, that one witness said that it seemed like there was a machine gun behind every tree, and they had to withdraw again on the 22nd. The timeline, we advance the timeline because the forces are split then. The mountain troops are sent to outflank. All right, because they're down then in the foothills. That's their territory, and even they struggled trying to outflank the New Zealand forces, and they're pushing them back. By the 23rd, they'd taken Platanius. All right, there was also a link up from troops that were southwest of Hania, meeting troops along the coast road. The next big episode is the Battle for Galatas. All right, mountain troops entering Galatas. This was pretty much a bloodbath at Galatas, but fantastic defense by New Zealand and Australian troops, one of many bayonet charges and mad counterattacks that drove the Gebirgsjäger, the mountain troops, out of Galatas. But once the Allies realized that they couldn't hold the town, they withdrew, and the mountain troops moved in on the morning of the 26th. But they just found the streets filled with their dead, and a handful of New Zealand, Australian dead, but it really was heavy losses for mountain troops at Galatas. Of course, then the next couple of days are spent preparing for an attack on Hania, finally, because you've got paratroopers on the coast road from the assault regiment, you've got the 3rd regiment, you've got more mountain troops coming in, some outflanking to the south. And on the 27th, the Fallschirmjäger's last offensive operation in the western part of the island is against Hania, and Hania is taken, although there was only really a smaller rear guard outside of Hania. Hania had been completely blitzed by the Luftwaffe anyway. And like I said, the Fallschirmjäger offensive operations really ended on the 27th of May when Hania was taken. I've put a little red line there. I've got to mention that red line. That red line on there, Paul, is 42nd Street. All right. And another book about the 42nd Street, New Zealand and Australian forces, the last bayonet charge of the Battle of Crete by these brave guys protecting the western approaches to Suda, took massive casualties on the 141st Mountain Division west of Suda at the point of a bayonet. They didn't like it up them, all right, and that their counterattack on these mountain troops also allowed a lot of men to escape between them and Suda down to the south. The next one, Paul, Retimo, again stalemate in Retimo. Not gonna hang around on Retimo. The paratroopers were reduced really to 2 defensive positions, one in the olive oil factory up into the northeast, and Chapel Hill and the outskirts of Paravolia. They didn't achieve anything at all. Attack, counterattack. They were stalled from Retimo by Cretan gendarmes who stopped them from getting into Retimo. It was heavy losses. Colonel Sturm was captured on the 21st, so they lost their regimental commander the day after they landed. They also had their regimental orders captured, so they knew everything about the attack. They knew they weren't being reinforced. This absolutely infuriated Sturm. Sturm was absolutely furious, wanted to know which officer had been taken from. That's all he was worried about. But by the 29th of May, as we'll see in a minute briefly, the Gebirgsjäger who'd moved up east from Hania from the east reached Retimo. Right, my mouth's so dry now. Reached Retimo.
Have some water, Greg, for goodness sake, have a sip of water.
And on the 30th, the last resistance there, the last of the Australian troops surrendered. So the battle for Retimo finished with the final surrender there on the 30th of May when the tanks actually caught up with the mountain troops. And then the Gebirgsjäger, the mountain troops, continue off towards Heraklion, which we go to now. And again, on Heraklion, there had been a failed assault on the town. And basically, like Heraklion, they had 2 defensive positions, one outside the town and one on the eastern side of the airfield. and were restricted to the defence only. They still hadn't achieved their objectives at Heraklion. They did get reinforcements on the 24th of May. Then troops from the city area were moved to a hill 296, you can see on the map, south of the airfield, to prepare themselves for an attack on the airfield. But overnight on the 28th and 29th of May, the British evacuated Heraklion by sea from the port. So in the early morning of 29th of May, realizing they're not coming under fire, the Germans walk to the airfield and it's completely empty, a few stragglers here and there. They go into the town of Heraklion. Nobody, no, it's a ghost town of military personnel. So they only achieved their objectives when their enemy had left by sea. And then, of course, the 2nd Battalion of the 2nd Regiment, who were then sent westward to meet the advancing mountain troops, where they met on the 30th of May. And that's basically that from the eastern side. This is the last bit. I said before that the last offensive operations of the German paratroopers on Crete took place when the battle for Hania. The mountain troops were then in this unplanned event, which was to pursue the Allied forces south to Slovakia. And I mean, that's a story in itself. I find that fascinating, this trek of, what, 50 kilometers or something south over the mountains to get to Slovakia. Some are evacuated, some aren't. Some bomb burst into the countryside, helped by civilians. Others managed to get across in ingenious ways. It is a fantastic story to talk about. But the mountain troops pursue them. For the airborne troops in the west, Ringel ordered these new orders. They had to go and clear the Akrotiri Peninsula of any enemy troops, protect the coast, because they were still worried about an amphibious assault then by Allied forces, because they were retreating. They thought they would be bringing more troops in by sea. So then the Germans were guarding the coast on the western part of the island. Ringel was completely unaware that the Allied troops were moving south. He thought they were moving east towards Retimo and Heraklion, because most of the Luftwaffe had been withdrawn on the 26th for preparations for Barbarossa. So he'd lost the majority of his reconnaissance aircraft. So it was only scouting parties that managed to spot these troops heading south, and it suddenly clicked, hang on a minute, they're heading south to evacuate, they're not heading east. So the story for the airborne forces stops there, but continues for the mountain troops as they pursue across the mountains of Slovakia on the 1st of June. Losses, different loss counts, different documents. The 11th Flieger Corps gives a different count to 4th Air Fleet, but we're talking about, we'd say between 1,500 and 2,000 killed, all right? Almost the same, 1,500 missing. And the reason missing is because of the terrain. So many men went missing. A lot were found during the rest of the war, during the occupation, and a lot after the war, but there's still quite a few men missing. High wound count. So out of, there's probably about a quarter of the forces, just under a quarter of the forces were written off. And for the Allied forces, a fairly low number, really, 1,700, just over 1,700 killed, 1,700 wounded. POWs quite high though. They had to leave a lot of men behind, including Greeks, but they did manage to evacuate 17,000 1st of June. But of course, the civilians paid the massive price for the Battle of Crete, and I'm not going to go into the reprisal actions on the 2nd June. They're well publicised, and
it came up in the sidebar earlier on. Yeah, it was already, people had already discussed it a little bit. Yeah,
no veteran ever mentioned that. Funnily enough, about reprisal actions, I think they were sort of in agreement that it was just because of what had happened. A lot of, oh God, it's so emotive to talk about. Fueled by hearsay and rumor. That was going to be the title of this slide, hearsay and rumor, because every veteran I spoke to had heard of a paratrooper being mutilated, of bestial acts committed on him. And so word got around to senior officers, got back to Berlin, that these things were happening everywhere. But you've got to remember, these young boys never been subtropical climate, never seen a dead body, they've never seen a black and bloated body where the wounds are opened and exasperated, and bits are missing. Because I know a guy who lives in Crete now, he says the chickens will eat your eyes if you lie on the ground long enough. So all sort of hearsay and rumor, they've been butchered. we do know that civilian did attack paratroopers and some mutilations took place. I think the number was blown out, and some of it post-mortem, but Göring wasn't going to wait around for the investigation that was implemented, and he informed students that punitive measures to be carried out. And for example, 2 of these so-called reprisal actions were conducted in Condamari and on the 2nd of June. Bottom right photograph there, the guy looking towards the camera, Horst Trebers, who was pretty much dramatic, jumped at the opportunity because his battalion had been butchered, massacred at east of Malmö. Took along 25-30 men from the 2nd Battalion Assault Regiment, and they shot, I think, 20 to 30 civilians in Condamari with no trial. But thanks to the Franz Peter Weixler, the war correspondent, we know about it. There's hardly anything about, as far as I'm aware, about Ali Kianu shootings, but Condamari is well documented, and he even gave evidence at war crimes trials after the war regarding these events on Crete. But I'll leave it there. There's a lot out there written. A guy that us in the community know about the Battle of Crete, Stefan McNeil, died about 3 or 4 weeks ago. He did a lot of work on war crimes in Greece and Crete, and he's published some really good books out there in English that you can follow up on.
Yeah, I mean, it's not, we're not dismissing it, but it's a separate subject, isn't it? It should be discussed in its own. It is,
and it veterans never talked about it because I think they just saw it as a sort of just thing for what happened. But it was all driven by hearsay and rumor. No veteran I knew ever saw it. They always heard it, or that this had happened.
It's always the case. It's always what you heard, not what you saw. These stories, the stories you have in Normandy, the stories in the Ardennes. So often it's you've heard something that happened that someone else said that they heard happened, and you actually try and find the originator of this thing, and it's hard to actually track down sometimes. But yeah, it's suffice it to say, some nasty stuff happened, and some of it is, we'll move on from that, I think. But let's
just 5 seconds, Paul, on that top photograph. I know it looks quite gruesome. I should have put a warning on it, but this photograph was given to me by a 1st Regiment veteran who fought at Heraklion, and for the rest of his life after Crete, he swore blind because he was told that these men have been butchered by civilians. When in actual fact, I know for some joint research with Yanis Prikatsanakis and another guy, that these men were killed in the public toilets on the harbour mole in Heraklion by hand grenades and small arms fire. So we know that they weren't killed by civilians, but Sepp Jendrishik, the veteran who had this photograph, was positive that these men had been killed by, when in actual fact, with a bit of research between different people, you find out, well, they actually more than likely weren't. So again,
it's emotions are so important in this, aren't they? And then it's complicated, this, and but yeah.
Right. So I think it's his last slide now, Paul, because we're going to give the final word to Winston Churchill. And he said that Göring's victory in Crete, however, was no more than a Pyrrhic victory. For the troops he was forced to sacrifice in order to take Crete could have been utilised, which is Cyprus, Iraq, Syria, and possibly even Persia. And he's absolutely right, because after Crete, Hitler decreed that there would be, the day of the paratrooper is over, and they were restricted to ground fighting, fire brigades, small operations from 1943 onwards, and that was it.
Well, that's it, and I think I mean that's it in terms of that's what Churchill sums it up perfectly. And I think in terms of me, thank you very much for talking yourself to the point where you can't talk. It's been an amazing presentation, but the thing is, there's so much to unwrap with this, because you have a battle that it looked like the airborne assault by the Germans was going to end in complete disaster. They somehow managed to hang on by the skin of their teeth, and they don't, and they succeed. And the British also have this semi-victory bit in that they do evacuate about half of their force, so they they get a kind of Dunkirk story out of it as well. And then there's the impact that it one of those many factors that affects the beginning of Barbarossa in terms of logistics and troops and dates. And so it's the study of the Battle of Crete is interesting in its own right, but it's how it affects things down the line, I think, is even more interesting, because, as you say, there are no more large-scale German airborne operations. The Allies are watching this as well. It must go into the thinking about how the Allies are developing their airborne forces, lessons learned. By the time you get to the Americans and British landing in North Africa and Sicily, we're obviously taking on some of the things that have happened to the Germans here on Crete. So it's placing it in that context of the battle itself is really amazingly interesting. But there's also, as I say, this effect it has down the line on future airborne operations from both sides, which is so fascinating.
Yeah. And I knew that we wouldn't get the time to go into any great detail, and because it's such a big battle over so many areas, and there's so much from it, and the aftermath and knock-on effects. I know, but I hope that it may have inspired somebody to go out and read further. That's
no, definitely, and people on that subject, you can do no better than starting with Greg's own book of Fallschirmjäger accounts. The link is in the description below, folks. I've been advertising it there. It's a great book. I've got a copy on my shelf there. And as there's your presentation was outstanding, but the bit that the icing on the cake, so to speak, is those quotes from the men who are actually there. It just puts it into what they were feeling, what their experiences were, because there's a lot of moving parts this battle. Right at the beginning, you explained it's separate groups there. You could do 2 hours on just one of those battles, let alone trying to cover all four major battles over about 13 days. So job well done. I'll just remind people what we've got coming up next week, and I'll come back and say goodbye in a second. So, folks, that was a fantastic start to Airborne Week. Tomorrow, we are off to Corregidor in the Far East. At the end of the war, the American landings by the 503rd PIR into Corregidor in 1945 with Kevin Maurer. That'll be fantastic. And then later in the week, we've got Prit Buttar talking about why the airborne operations the Soviets got involved in. We've got Primosole Bridge on Friday. And we've got James Daly talking about the operations, the Allied operations that never happened between between Overlord and Market Garden, as the Allies were pushing their way through normally the Falaise Gap, racing to the Seine. There are various operations the First Allied Air Army had planned that didn't end up happening because events on the ground overtook what was happening back in planning in London and what have you. So, well, that's 4 outstanding shows that are coming up your way. As usual, folks, check out Greg's website in the description below. Check out his Twitter account. Check out his Facebook account. Buy the book. And that's all I need to say about that. But right now, it just remains for me to say thank you very much, Greg Way, for joining us. You deserve either a beer or vodka or whiskey or your tipple of choice now.
Yeah, it will be.
And welcome to my world. I have to do this. I do this every night. That's why I was going to have a beer after a show. Fantastic. So, everybody, thanks very much for sticking with us. I will see you all again tomorrow night with Kevin Maurer for our talk about Corregidor. This is Paul Woodhouse for World War II TV. Enjoy the rest of your day.